One of the most notable themes in the media we consume, whether it be books, films, or TV, is that of the tragic character. Often, the individual in question is the hero of the story, but what happens when it's the villain who's the victim of this dreadful fate? Such is the case for a number of villains from the iconic dark fantasy series Berserk. It humanizes the villain, granting their character a layer of gravitas that draws the audience in, which adds even more impact to the story as a whole. Apostles, as they're called, were initially humans who were chosen by the laws of causality, which is an esoteric idea governing the world of Berserk, and it caused them to inherit a magical totem called a Behelit. As such, they really didn't have any choice regarding what befell them or where fate led them. These fiends, who are bound by no morality or law, have given up their humanity in exchange for power and eternal life. However, such unbridled strength doesn't come without exacting a terrible price, which in this case is the life of someone that the apostle holds more dear than their own soul. It is said that losing this person should leave a void in one's being. Some of them made this choice quite easily, while for others it was made for them. Although we cannot condone the heinous and inhumane acts of these monsters, some of these individuals are truly ill-fated characters who couldn't resist the destiny set for them by causality. In today's marvelous anime video, we're going to discuss why apostles are not just monsters, but tragic victims of their own fate. Our hope is that by the end of this video, you'll not only gain a fresh perspective on these monsters, but also have a newfound appreciation for the extremely intelligent storytelling skills of Kentaro Miura. So, without wasting any more time, grab your Behelits and keep your hearts strong as we dive once more into the grim, dark world of Berserk, my fellow strugglers. The role of causality in their creation. For one to become an apostle, you first have to be chosen by causality. This leads to you inheriting an eerie magical totem called a Behelit. There is no one particular way for a person to find a Behelit, as it makes its way into their hands through the seas of eternity at a time and place that is already preordained. From the very beginning, the future apostle has no faculty over their choices. As fate directs their path, they eventually reach a point in their lives where they are faced with an insurmountable amount of despair. In response to this and certain other conditions being met, their Behelit activates with its disarranged human features coalescing into that of a tortured face streaming rivers of blood from its eyes as it lets out a blood-curdling eldritch scream. In that moment, the person is transported into an interdimensional space where they are granted an audience with the members of the God Hand. These are the most powerful agents of evil in Berserk. Together, they grant the person in question a choice. They could be reborn as an apostle to do things as they saw fit, unbound by anything, to achieve their heart's desire. The price they ask, however, is something that can't be replaced, as it's an integral part of the person's very being. It could be their wife, their daughter, their lover, or even their own comrades in arms. As long as losing said people is equivalent to losing the apostle candidate's own souls, the sacrifice is deemed worthy. Once the person agrees to this deal, this precious individual is branded with a mark of sacrifice and killed as part of an unholy sacrament. In this way, an apostle is birthed as they rise, having transcended their humanity in exchange for their soul, serving no one outside of the God Hand. However, just because they sacrificed someone they care about doesn't mean that they always did so willingly, as you'll see later in this video. Exploring the role of love, hope, and innocence in creating an apostle. Hope and innocence. Well, it is certainly despair that drives potential apostles into a corner, forcing them to make this terrible choice. We believe there's myriad emotions that contribute to their creation. For a person to be capable of feeling such depths of despair, they have to be able to hope against hope. No ordinary feelings of despondency are able to trigger the Behelit, as one has to be at their absolute rock bottom for the totem to respond. This leads us to believe that while despair is the emotion that triggers it, the more overarching emotion that is vastly more important in the process is hope. For example, Rosine clung to the hope that one day she would be freed from her misery and be able to live with the elves of the Misty Valley. Even though there were no elves, she held a fervent hope that one day her dreams would come true. It is only when her father utterly crushes this hope that it dawns on Rosine that the elves were not going to save her, nor was her father going to stop abusing her mother and her. That truly breaks her, starting her descent into becoming an apostle. Rosine wasn't an evil being, she was simply a young girl who wanted to escape her reality. She is the definition of the type of character that we're talking about in this video. Her innocence is corrupted beyond recognition, leading her to sacrifice her parents to become an apostle. What makes it even worse is that she was just a kid, despite which she held out so long against the abuse she was subjected to day in and day out. Her outlook on life was brimming with positivity and kindness. It is therefore not a coincidence that she fell from grace as hard as she did when something truly broke inside of her after causality finally caught up to her. Love! For a person to be overcome with such strong feelings of defeat and futility, something equally drastic needs to have driven them towards this dark edge. Let's take the example of the Count, who is one of the first apostles we encounter in the series. Initially, he's introduced as a despotic lord who secretly revels in torture and devours his subjects. While this is found to be true, his origins are once again steeped in tragedy and love. The Count was once a loving family man and a well-respected ruler who hunted pagan heretics with an overwhelming zeal. This fervor for executing heretics was only topped by his love for his wife and daughter. However, one day, his world would come crumbling down after returning home early from a pagan hunt. He is greeted by the sight of his loving wife engaged in a hedonistic pagan orgy. Despite being caught, the Count's wife merely sneers at him, knowing full well that he wouldn't harm her. Unable to come to grips with his emotions, feeling betrayed and hurt, but at the same time being very much in love with his wife, he tries to kill himself, leading to the Behelit activating due to his despondency. A normal human reaction would be to immediately end that relationship or pursue other courses of action to deal with the situation. However, the Count's reaction is something that most humans wouldn't even consider. If the Count hadn't been capable of loving his wife to the point that he would rather kill himself than punish her, he would not have been able to achieve the levels of despair that he did. It therefore goes without saying that love is just as important an emotion for the creation of an apostle. In fact, it is the presence of love that adds even more tragedy to their tale. Deeply personal trauma evokes empathy for the apostles. If you look at the most prominent apostles that Guts has come across, whose backstories have been given to us, they all share one thing in common. They all share a bond of a deeply personal, trauma-laden past which pushed them over the edge to become monsters. For instance, Ganishka had everything any man could ever wish for. He had family, wealth, women, an army, and even a kingdom. However, despite all of this, his life had been spent constantly looking out for daggers in the shadows, even from his own family members. Having lived in fear and paranoia his whole life, when his very son tries to assassinate him, that becomes the straw that breaks the camel's back as he gives in and becomes an apostle. If you look at it from a distance, even Ganishka is an extremely tragic character. He's a man who has everything that he wants but nothing that he needs. He's an emperor, but he doesn't have a moment to spare to enjoy these things. Instead, he turns into a fiend, devouring all in his wake, burning kingdoms to ashes in the hopes that one day he'll have conquered it all, leaving no one to threaten him so that he no longer has to feel that fear or paranoia. What a tragic existence that is. Now let's take a look at Grunbeld, the great flame dragon, who is one of the commanders of the new Band of the Hawk under a resurrected Griffith. Once upon a time, this baleful warrior was the bane of the Tudors, slaughtering all those who stood before his might. However, not even Grunbeld, who could slaughter 100 foes on his own in the battlefield, had the strength to stop what fate had in store for him. Betrayed by his lord and best friend, the great flame dragon would be on the verge of death while protecting the two women he held dearest to him. Even as all hope was lost and his sight began to fade, his Behelit was activated. Left with no choice as he laid dying watching Edvard, his former best friend, about to rape his friends Benedicte and Sigurd, he sacrifices the two women who were already dying and becomes an apostle. Grunbeld is perhaps the most tragic apostle in the entire series. His life was filled with nothing but trauma. At an early age, his mother was raped and murdered while he is sent to be raised by the enemy. Throughout his formative years, he is constantly thrust into danger alongside Sigurd and Edvard. After finally attaining his freedom and achieving a semblance of normalcy, his very lord conspires against him out of jealousy for his growing popularity. His own friend Edvard is equally jealous of being in his shadow and harboring an unrequited love for Sigurd, who loved Grunbeld instead. Despite being a mighty man, he couldn't save himself from being entangled in a web of conspiracy that eventually forced him to devour the very people he loved. Grunbeld could have very well been the tragic hero of his own tale had he not gone down a darker path. As for Rosine, we've already discussed how she was traumatized by her father's constant abusive behavior towards her mother and her. This was because, during her father's absence before her birth, her village had been pillaged by an invading force. The soldiers of this army had murdered and raped countless people in her village. After her father returned from the army, he suspected Rosine to be a bastard child of an enemy. He curses both women for his ill fortune, thus subjecting them to daily torment. In the case of the Count, few things could be more tragic than still loving a wife that you had just caught in an orgy with the group of people you hated the most. Despite turning into monsters to escape their current predicaments, these individuals had been subjected to the worst things that humanity was capable of. This deep-seated trauma adds a different dimension to their character and turns them into individuals who are more than just your average villains. We, as the audience, can't help but feel sorry for them on some level and even empathize with certain aspects of their story. The evocation of such emotions within the audience greatly contributes to them being viewed as not just monsters, but tragic characters. Apostles retain traces of their humanity. The act of transforming into an apostle is an irreversible one. After transcending one's humanity and turning into a monster who is unfettered by any laws save for one's own will and that of the God Hand, most apostles lose all traces of their humanity. However, there have been cases where this has been shown to not be true. In the case of Rosine, she doesn't immediately turn one of her close friends into a pseudo-apostle. She seems to take an uncharacteristically long time placing her in one of the birthing cocoons. This could be because Rosine still cherished the bond that the two shared while they were humans, even then in a twisted fashion. Furthermore, as she lies fatally wounded, she remembers becoming an apostle and silently begs for her parents' forgiveness. These moments make the audience feel pity towards her, further enhancing her tragic character. The Count, in his fight with Guts, manages to reawaken his Behelit for the second time. However, he refuses to sacrifice his daughter's life in exchange for a new lease on his own, which leads to his ultimate demise. Despite being a heartless monster, he still retains his love for his daughter. We are made to believe that apostles lose all semblance of humanity from their form to their heart, but this is categorically false as proven here. Even Grunbeld, as he awakens as an apostle, recognizes the tragedy bestowed upon him before devouring Sigurd and Benedicte. Yes, they are fundamentally twisted and changed, but the degree to which this change occurs seems to depend on the individual. For example, Grunbeld, Locus, Irvine, and even Zod don't seem to be unnecessarily cruel and reprehensible. They do kill in a brutal fashion if needed, but the very sight of a human doesn't immediately drive them into a feeding frenzy. If you look at Irvine's character, he's mostly introverted and seems to enjoy hunting wildlife and camping in the woods while playing his lute. These things sound oddly human for an apostle to enjoy doing, and we can safely say that these are the vestiges of his humanity that Irvine still carries with him. He even allows Sonia to warm herself next to him while engaging her in normal conversation, displaying zero bloodlust. This is a stark change from the early apostles like the overtly cruel Snake Baron, who feasted on the people under his rule and was willing to raze the entire town for food and sport. We also see the lesser apostles working under Griffith in his new Band of the Hawk, fighting alongside human warriors. Although this may be more out of fear than the goodness of their hearts, it still shows us that they can exercise restraint if needed. All of these things invoke a feeling in the audience which makes us question all of our previous conceptions regarding the nature of an apostle. When you see how honorable Zod is, what a tragic past Grunbeld has, and the almost human behavior of Irvine, you just can't help but feel sorry on some level for these individuals, which builds them up as tragic characters. Apostles are tragic, incomplete monsters. Just as we discussed how apostles retain some of their humanity in the previous section, this lets us segue neatly into our next point. We believe that apostles are tragic, incomplete monsters. One of the biggest points we'd like to make regarding this is how apostles regain their humanity at the very moment of their demise. If the process of transforming into an apostle is irreversible, it should be so even in death. How is it that in their final moments, these creatures seem to realize their mistakes? Looking at both Rosine and the Count, both seem to understand the extent of their madness during their final hour. As we mentioned, Rosine tries to say a final apology to her parents, while the Count has a regret-filled countenance while looking at his daughter in his last moments. There's also the fact that when an apostle dies, they transform back into their human body. Shouldn't their body retain their monstrous visages if they had truly become these remorseless, twisted demons? It's almost as if a malaise has been lifted from their body once they perish. We have already mentioned in the previous section how they retain traces of their humanity. Suppose they are truly 100% monsters. Why do such traces linger on? The very fact that they are not completely transformed, body, mind, and soul, with no lingering traces of humanity, shows that the people that they sacrificed were killed for something that wasn't even fully real. They did not fully escape the yoke of humanity, but were instead transformed into these abominable creatures who were still flawed. This lends another layer to their tragic nature and proves how, in the grand scheme of causality, there is no winner, only victims. Eternal justification and self-loathing. Apostles abandon their humanity in search of overcoming the pain that they can no longer stand. However, if one examines this carefully, the very crux of their inhuman transformation is rooted in a very human desire to escape suffering. The tragedy, however, lies in the fact that despite giving up their humanity to overcome their weakness becomes the most defining part of their legacy. They have rejected the parts of humanity that they thought made them weak, but in doing so, have doomed themselves to an eternity of suffering. As humans, it is by overcoming adversity and weakness that we grow stronger and more resilient. However, for a person who has rejected this concept, they will forever remain a slave to whatever it is that they feared. For example, Ganishka was a paranoid and fearful ruler. Instead of confronting his fears and overcoming them, he transforms himself into a monster in the hopes that he will overcome these human weaknesses. However, as we see, even as an apostle, he is still consumed by the same fear and paranoia that drives him to bring the entire world under his heel. They live out their immortal existence, subconsciously loathing themselves and the choices they have made. However, twisted by evil, they would much rather cover up this weakness by inflicting suffering on others to prove to themselves that they had indeed grown stronger than humans and that their choice was the correct one. They rape, murder, and consume people just to blot out the very weakness that had led them to become monsters. These individuals loathe their capacity to love and equate it to weakness because they themselves have been damaged and hurt while doing the same. They allow their scars to define them by taking the easy and selfish way out. When Rosine comes to grips with what she has done to become an apostle, she immediately becomes regretful, proving our point. At the end of the day, they are destined to live out a life which is an illusion of freedom and strength. Even after damning their loved ones' souls along with their own, they do not truly escape the torment that they wished to. Instead, they linger, spreading suffering and chaos, trying to justify their choices and fragile self-worth. What could be a more pitiable and tragic existence than that? Contrasting the apostles with Guts. Have you ever considered the thought that Guts is actually a potential apostle candidate? We do not yet know whether a marked person can still become an apostle, but it is important to note that he is in possession of Behelit. As we know, Behelits do not come into someone's possession just for show. Only those chosen by the law of causality come to get their hands on one. It can therefore be inferred that Guts' Behelit is with him for a reason. Added to this fact is that he has gone through as much suffering as any of the apostles when they were still human. Guts never knew his biological parents. He was raised as a child soldier and raped by his own comrade. He lost his best friend only for him to return to rape his lover and kill all of their comrades. As you can see, Guts has a backstory that is equally tragic, but his Behelit has never been activated even once. He is the epitome of human will and perseverance and what mankind can achieve in the face of insurmountable odds, even as fate is trying to beat you into submission. When you contrast the apostles to Guts, we truly get to see how frail and weak they are both emotionally and psychologically because of the choices they made. He is one character they cannot say doesn't understand the suffering that they had to endure. While they made the selfish choice to sacrifice someone else in order to overcome their weakness, Guts showed the audience what the alternate route was. Sure, he's constantly hunted by evil spirits and monsters, but that is what it means to be a struggler and a human. Life will always be full of challenges, and there will be times when all hope seems lost. However, at the end of the storm, there is a golden sky, and those who weather the dark days become stronger in the long run. In this regard, the apostles seem even more tragic because all that power they acquired seems to be all for nothing because they have missed out on the chance to gain true strength and resilience. Instead, they have become objects of hatred and loathing, despised to their bitter ends. Marvelous verdict! There is no condoning the actions of the apostles, but they are even more flawed now than they were as humans, despite having supposedly transcended their humanity. It's ironic how these inhuman monsters try to desecrate and dehumanize their victims. It is truly a tragedy that by becoming these monsters in a bid to become a higher form of life, they have actually regressed and become a lower form of life. From their appearance to their personality, with the exception of a few, most of them are like beasts, acting on their base instincts without any potential for growth. Their very existence is a purgatory which they will never escape, as they no longer possess the faculty to redress where they went wrong. It is only in death that they are freed momentarily before being consumed by the abyss. It is a tragic existence that these individuals are condemned to, but what's even more tragic is that they don't realize this at any point. Miura's ability to tell a brilliant and intelligent story is on full display when one looks at the apostles. One must remember that these are side characters, despite the fact that he has put so much thought and care into their creation. In fact, it's not a stretch to say that these individuals feel more layered than some main characters in other anime and manga. We hope that with this video, you got to see how some of these depraved monsters were tragic characters as well. Our mission today was not to just talk about apostles being tragic, but also to increase your knowledge regarding Berserk as a whole. We would love to hear your thoughts regarding this topic as well, so be sure to tell us who you believe is the most tragic apostle out of the bunch and why in the comments. If you liked this video, we're sure you'll love what we have in store for you on our channel, so be sure to check that out when you're done here. For now though, our time together is at an end. We hope to see you soon in the next one. Until then, stay safe and stay marvelous.